Hey everyone, my name is Gabe Biderman from National Parks at Night. And tonight we are going to talk about best camera settings for night photography. However, if you want to learn about more of our educational videos, hit that subscribe button below. Night photography offers a variety of ways that we can capture and create, just like the day, right? There's not just one light that's always present, and then I can give you a secret recipe that'll solve all your night issues. However, what we hope to do tonight is give you a better understanding of the settings and the tools that you have inside the camera so that you can make better decisions at night. We live in a wonderful era for night photography, as most of the digital cameras and mirrorless cameras from the last 2 to 3 years are going to excel at night photography. So here I have the latest. This is the Sony A7R Mark III. It's set up on program mode. Let's take a picture and see what it sees. And it found focus pretty quickly, which that's a nice point. And it actually did a pretty good job. Again, this is in P for program mode. So the camera is doing all of the thinking right now. And it shows 12,800 ISO, 2.8, and a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second. It did a pretty good job, but do we really need to be at 12,800? You know, a camera, when it's thinking, it's gonna think, I wanna be stable for you. It doesn't know that I'm on a tripod. So it kind of will always raise the ISOs first, open up the apertures as wide as it can be, and I have a 16 to 35 2.8 lens up. So it's letting in a lot of light with the lens, as much as it can. So then it's gonna raise up the ISO to a point that it'll get the shutter speed to a reasonably decent shutter speed, because again, it doesn't know if it's on a tripod, if you're hand holding it. It's gonna think 9 times out of 10 that you're hand holding it. And most of us cannot hold a camera for 1/10 of a second. Usually the lowest that we can hold, hand hold a camera, is somewhere between a 60th and a 30th of a second. Often with our daytime shooting, we're shooting in a priority mode, whether that's program mode and we're letting the camera just operate like a point and shoot and snap and quick mode and we're not thinking about anything, or aperture mode, which is a popular mode where we can kind of control the depth and whether we want a shallow depth of field or a lot of depth in the scene. And then there's shutter speed priority, often used when we want to capture the scene, freeze action in the scene, or elongate and show movement in the scene with a longer exposure. Now, generally you would think with nighttime photography, that would be the mode that we want to be in, but it's actually manual mode. The M mode, that's the mode we want to live in, because in that mode, we're going to be juggling the ISOs, apertures, and shutter speeds, and making the decisions based upon what is in front of our camera. So let's first talk about time, because time is sort of the reason why we do night photography. We can play with time. We can dilate it and get really long exposures and make clouds move, cars trail, stars trail, all that kind of fun stuff. Or we can also look at what, if there's nothing moving in the scene, do we need a long exposure? Maybe it's a quick capture at night. So again, time is one of the funnest things we can play with at night, but it's not the solution to everything. So here in this scene, there's really not much moving. Obviously it's snowing out, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that later. But right now, let's 45th of a second, we can go lower than that. And we can maybe see and maybe capture some of this snow. So I'm going to go to my dial right here and kind of move that up to where the baseline exposure kind of says it should be. And that's at a 1/6 of a second. Now, I'm gonna go lower than that because there's no reason also for me to be shooting wide open at 2.8. I can close down my shutter speed, my aperture, and get a little bit longer of an exposure, and I can go to a lower ISO and get optimal image quality. So let's continue to move that shutter speed, down to something fun like 1 second, when we can really kind of start to see some movement. So now it says on the back of the screen that I am 2 stops overexposed. And let's kind of go over here and kind of just apply that right to the aperture right there. And that says I'm at 5.6, I'm only a half of stop overexposed. And let's take a picture. And that's a pretty good picture. And we have a histogram that's sort of filled up in the middle. Nothing's kind of crushed all the way to the left, and nothing's crushed all the way to the right. And if we compare that sort of to the last image, the last couple images we made, that was shot in priority mode with the camera making the decisions. It's blinking with Sony cameras, it blinks when shadows have no detail in them. The first shot did an okay job, but you could see we got a better shot just by kind of manually adjusting it using the meter. What I will say is that meters and digital cameras are really good. So most of photography is captured at a fraction of a second, but the beauty of night photography is that we're oftentimes in the seconds, minutes, and even hours that we can capture and create an image. Now this image worked at 1 second, and every camera out on the market right now can go from those fractions of a second to 30 seconds. And then once we hit 30 seconds, then we're gotta go into B for bulb mode, okay? And bulb mode, what bulb mode will let you do is basically if you plug in a intervalometer, and it can be just the basic kind, star trails, car trails, anything beyond that 30 seconds, or if it's really dark out, we're gonna need an intervalometer, and we're gonna click that. And that will, when we click it, it'll start the exposure, and then we click it again, or when we program it in for a specific time, that'll end the exposure. And that can be also 5, 10, 15 seconds, or it could be 5, 10, 15 minutes, or it could be 5, 10, 15 hours. Pretty cool, huh? So how do we best assess the night scene and then make the choices between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed to help us best tell the story that's going on? So I walked over here and I was attracted. I like the shape of this building, and I like the smoke that's coming out from behind it. So I've got a nice composition, I've got a nice kind of foreground shape in front of me, and I've also got movement in the scene, okay? And I always am kind of drawn to that movement and how I can emphasize that at night. And how are we going to assess movement? With our shutter speeds, right? So if you think about it, we're in manual mode, but we're going to go and think shutter speed priority. So let's find out which shutter speed is best for this scene. And I'm thinking not that long of a shutter speed will be needed for us to really emphasize the movement. So I'm gonna go and do a sort of a moderate ISO of ISO 800, which will still be a nice clean ISO. I have it all the way open at 2.8, and I chose 2 seconds. And the meter reading in the camera said that that was an evenly exposed scene, and I took the picture. And here we go. And I like the movement there. You know, we have the nice kind of cloud movement up at the top at 2 seconds at 2.8. And then from there, I increase the time by 1 stop. And again, when we increase the time by 1 stop, we're going to double the time. So we're gonna go from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. I'm gonna subtract 1 stop with my aperture and add 1 stop with my shutter speed. There's 4 seconds at f4. And again, you know, it's also a matter of these clouds are kind of moving different ways, so always be kind of looking up and assessing the scene. I like the movement at 4 seconds, but I don't like kind of where the clouds are there. There's 8 seconds. And at 8 seconds, it's still looking like there's still some structure and detail to the clouds. What I'm wary of, especially with cloud movement, is when we kind of start to smear the clouds and we start to lose any sort of detail in them. It's a balance of getting a little bit of that detail, that little fluffiness in there, or that sense of movement in there, but also not having them turn into just white streaks in the sky. So I think 8 seconds is still looking good. And 15 seconds, what's interesting is these longer times are giving us a few more formations in the sky that we can play with. So that's kind of cool. And again, I'm doing my best to judge the back of the LCD screen. I'm gonna collect a little bit more information and really study it on the big screen at home. And there's 30 seconds. And what I'm seeing at 30 seconds is that things are kind of starting to lose its detail. Things are starting to smear, okay? And let's go, I did it one more time to 1 minute right here. My final aperture here is f11 at 1 minute. And we really kind of see the movement of the cloud, but I really don't think there's a lot of detail in that. I think I'm gonna be happy best with somewhere between 2 seconds and 15 seconds. All right, so I love this area that we're photographing in. And I do like that we're photographing in the snow. It just adds another element, really interesting element that we can capture and create in. And I really was drawn to this one. I love the lines again in this. I love the lines and the shadows of the pole. I love the light source here as well. I like working with street lights. Street lights can be really tricky to deal with at night, but I got a few tips on some of our camera settings that we can use to help take better shots when we have direct light sources like street lights or like the lights like on bridges in scenes. All right, now the first actually test shot I took, I chose an exposure of 15 seconds, f/16 at 1600 ISO. I'm using a smaller aperture so that I can make that direct light source have star points in it and kind of make the bright part of it, the sort of the bright bulbous part of it, smaller and give a little bit more star point action. It kind of makes street lights and lights on bridges a little bit more interesting. But what I noticed on this first shot, which again, my meter in my camera said that I had the correct exposure, but when I reviewed it, especially in the histogram mode, I'm getting blinkies in the screen. Now, I don't mind blinkies on the light bulbs, you know, the direct light sources. I don't need to know the wattage on that bulb, but I do not want the light that it's reflecting, the ground, the snow, I don't want that to be burnt out without any detail. So I realized that I am overexposed. I got a spike in the histogram and I got those blinkies. So I'm gonna have to underexpose this shot a little bit. And I'm gonna go from 15 seconds to 10 seconds. And I'm also gonna lower my ISO to 800. And that got me where I wanted to go. So the meter told me I was correct, but I was in fact 2 stops overexposed. And that's again the beauty of manual mode. We can assess the scene. We want to review everything. We want to review our histograms, monitor those meters, and really kind of pay attention to everything that's going on in the scene. So I've kind of mentioned that the aperture can kind of control how direct light sources create star points. Now, every lens is going to react to this a little bit differently. So while I can tell you that generally the smaller apertures like f/22, f/16, and f/11 will give you more star points, I can't tell you how many, nor can I tell you, is it going to be a blanket for every lens. Telephoto lenses seem to have more of them than wide angle lenses, and we're using a wide angle lens tonight. We're using, again, a 16-35 at 35. And if we take a close look here at 22, it's again a bit more subtle, and we're just seeing the star points kind of coming around that light source right there. And why is it doing that? Again, if you think about it, light is going and traveling through a small aperture, a small hole. So when it kind of comes in, it's kind of almost like flaring almost into it. So it's kind of creating that sort of flare, those star points with those direct light sources. And when we have a larger hole, like 2.8 or f4, light's kind of coming in at a very straight and flat pattern. So there's less sort of, flare coming out along the actual aperture blades that are letting that light in. So let's take a closer look. f/22 has definitely got the most star points around the light bulb. f/16 still looking pretty good. f/11 still has star points, a little less, a little bit more subtle. So it really kind of all depends. I wouldn't always necessarily default to the f/22 and f/16. It's a personal preference. I generally like to have a moderate amount of star points. I don't want you looking at the image and saying, "Oh, wow, there's star points all over the place." I want you to kind of look and be like, "Oh, that's interesting." I'm looking at the whole scene, and I'm not being distracted by that bright light source in the scene. Our eyes are always drawn to the bright light sources in the scene. So if we can use our aperture to dim it down and make it a little bit more interesting, it'll allow us to kind of take in the rest of the image a little bit better. Okay, so here we have f/11, f/8. f/8, it's starting with this lens it seems to be a little bit losing that star point capability, and 5.6 f/4, and we can really see with 2.8 it just looks like a light bulb and kind of uninteresting, but again, you might find it to be interesting. This light source isn't getting super big, and again, different lenses will react differently. I advise you to take a couple lenses out. For the most part, we've all got street lights next to us, so see how we can control them with our apertures at night. So I hope some of the examples that we've kind of explored tonight are giving you a better understanding how you can take control of your camera settings on your camera, and that you can move beyond just capturing stuff and really creating interesting stuff at night. Really think about what the scene is presenting, what your intention is, what you want to do with the scene. Do you want to emphasize time? Do you want to emphasize depth or make star points? Or do you want to have something super clean or granular, or you have to raise up their ISOs? These are the things we got to juggle. The color of it with the white balance. All these things we need to juggle at night. And each night scenario will give us different factors that will outweigh other ones. And it'll be on us to make those decisions and to continue seizing the night.